All right, let's go ahead and begin. Um, if you remember, we just tested over chapters 28 and 29, World War I, World War II, some major chapters there. And today we're going to discuss chapter 30, which is dealing with an important country on the AP test, always is Russia, and their revolution, which ultimately would lead to the rise of a guy by the name of Lenin, who hopefully you've heard of, and then eventually a guy by the name of Stalin. So we'll get into it. I hope that you find these videos useful. I hope that we can get back to class as soon as possible so we can continue these lessons in person. But for the meantime, we'll have to do this. If you have any questions over the material, you can send me an email. I am requiring that you guys will write or type out 2 pages of notes at least related to this video lesson. And it does not have to be complete sentences. It could be just bullet points, things that I say or things that you see on the screen that you think is valuable information, just to make sure that I know that you did go through it. And hopefully it'll also help you kind of remember the information. But let's jump into this. If you remember, guys, Russia had some problems. The Mongols come in, the serfs now become, the peasants now become serfs, and then the Mongols leave, and the life of the peasant gets worse. And Peter the Great, Catherine the Great especially, made serfdom something that was more prevalent and more intense, I guess you could say. Eventually, it's going to lead to, this is where it gets a little confusing. There's actually 2 revolutions in Russia as a result of the serfdom. And remember, the serfs were given freedom, right? They were given freedom in 1861, but they were subject to the redemption payments, and so their lives really didn't improve much. And so what we're going to see is 2 revolutions in 1917. And one of the main reasons why this revolution, this first one came in, was the misery of World War I. The majority of people in Russia did not want anything to do with World War I. They wanted out of the war. Industrial revolution in Russia. As you hopefully know, Russia began industrializing, but it wasn't like in Western Europe. Western Europe, we gradually saw the rise of people's income. Their standards of living went up. In Russia, that did not happen, okay? The people that were working in the factories, they remained in a very low social class. Ultimately, this revolution led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas, meaning that he gave up his throne in March of 1917. So a new government is going to come in, a provisional government, a temporary government, I guess you could say, is going to come in. And the problem with this is that this temporary government, this provisional government, refused to withdraw from World War I. You would think that, okay, you had this revolution, you had this change in government, we're going to see some changes. Well, they did not withdraw from World War I, and the people in Russia had demanded land. The peasants wanted land that they could call their own, and that would also be denied by this new government. So there would be a second revolution in November of 1917, the same year. It's the only country that I can think of that had 2 revolutions in 1 year. You think that things are bad here. I mean, they had 2 revolutions there in 1 year. A second revolution is going to remove this provisional government, and this guy here, Vladimir Lenin, is now going to take power, take control. And of course, he's the one who's going to bring communism into Russia. So if that's not confusing enough, you have these 2 revolutions. The second revolution, you see the rise of Vladimir Lenin. Well, some people, a group of people, are not going to be okay with Lenin taking over. So there's going to be civil war now. A war between two groups. You have the Reds versus the Whites. The Reds are supporters of communism, okay, supporters of Lenin, and the Whites are supporters of the Tsar. They want to bring the Tsar back. The United States was backing the Whites, and in the end, long story short, Lenin is going to win. His armies will win this civil war, and Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family are going to be executed. You know, the Romanov family that had control of Russia since the 1600s. Now, their entire family will be wiped out. So, Lenin is in control in 1917, and one of the first things he does is he gets out of World War I. He's going to give all this land here that we see in pink, hand that land over to the Germans. In exchange for that, they're going to be granted withdrawal from the war, which is what the people definitely want. Once again, the Treaty of Versailles caused a lot of problems for a lot of countries, and Russia was mainly ignored in that meeting as well, in that conference, because of the fact that they were communist. All right, so the Civil War, of course, we've talked about that already. The Reds are going to win. Talked about that. And when Lenin takes over, we're going to see a lot of major changes occurring. Land being given to the peasants, government taking over major industries. And ultimately, after a few years of Lenin's policies, agriculture and manufacturing declined. The communist system wasn't working in Russia. So Lenin realized that, hey, they need to make a change. They need to do something else. All right, so we'll get to that here in a second, but you also need to know this guy right here, Leon Trotsky, pictured right there. This is him right here in the top left of your screen. Leon Trotsky, the reason you need to know him is that he will become the leader of the army, the military for the Russians. The Red Army is what it would be called, Leon Trotsky. So Lenin has taken over 1917, and his communist policies are causing problems in the economy. So in 1921, he creates a policy called the New Economic Policy. Not very creative. You know, I could imagine that meeting. What should we call it? Well, it's a new economic policy, so we'll call it New Economic Policy. But anyway, you also could see it referred to as the NEP. What it allowed was private ownership of manufacturing and agriculture. So you as an individual can go own your own factory or go own your own farm. And guess what? Production started to increase. Amazing. Lenin will die in 1924, and Joseph Stalin, very important guy right over here. Joseph Stalin, here he is meeting with Lenin. What a friendship. And Stalin will take over. This guy is going to be extreme, and have a very nationalistic version of communism. If you see here, these are the kill counts of the top 10 most lethal dictators in world history. And the guy we're about to talk about right now, Joseph Stalin, responsible for up to 23 million deaths. We've already talked about Hitler. King Leopold was the guy in Belgium that was cutting people's hands off. And then Hideki Tojo. Okay, Hideki Tojo, we talked about him in World War II and his involvement in Pearl Harbor. 1927, Stalin has acquired full political power. Guess what? New economic policy is going to be terminated. Right? And Stalin wants the entire industrial sector to be controlled by government. Every industry, every factory to be controlled by the Communist Party governments. This is one of the most important slides right here. This will lead to many of the deaths under the Stalin regime, and it was called collectivization of agriculture. So what happened was the government would show up at your farm, which you owned, and the communist government would say, you don't own this farm anymore. And this farm now belongs to the government. Those crops belong to the government. Those workers you have are now government employees. Okay, everything that you worked for in your entire life is now going to be taken by the government. And as you could imagine, the people, the farmers, they were called kulaks. They were wealthy peasants that owned farmland. They're not going to just say, oh, okay, communist, no problem, sounds good. No, they're going to fight, and they are going to refuse to cooperate. Many of them would destroy their own crops, would destroy their own equipment, would destroy their own farms. And if you could imagine, if farmers across the United States today started just destroying their farms, we're going to run out of food. And so it's going to create a devastating famine. 6 million people will perish as a result of this situation. Collectivization of agriculture. Another thing you should know is that every communist, starting with Stalin, had something called 5-year plans. And that's what it is. They would meet and figure out, what are we going to do for 5 years? Okay, what's the plan going to be like for our economy? How many factories are we going to build? What products are we going to make? How are we going to distribute those? Who's going to get the products that we make? All of those decisions are made by governments. And the Soviet Union would eventually become the third industrial power in the world, only behind Germany and the United States. If you can recall chapter 23, the Industrial Revolution, when the Industrial Revolution really took a hold in Western Europe, you saw a lot of problems. We discussed that. And there would be a lot of problems as well with the Industrial Revolution taking place under Stalin. Crowded, inadequate housing, lots of issues. And one of the ways to circumvent those issues is that Stalin decided to issue out lots of welfare. Okay, even more than Western Europe. That might surprise you, but a lot of government money was being sent to those people that needed it. All right, Joseph Stalin, he was a very intense person, let me just put it that way. And in the 1930s, he had something called the Great Purge, where hundreds of his party leaders were intimidated into confessing imaginary crimes against the state. It could have been someone that he just didn't like personally, someone who he didn't like their face, he didn't like the things that they said, he thought they were against him, maybe paranoid, and many of these people would be put to death. It's no surprise that the media would be controlled by the communists under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. And he wanted to promote terror throughout the country, try to intimidate people. All right. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Stalin is going to be working with the Western democracies to block the German threats. Hitler will ultimately invade the Soviet Union, and that will be devastating, of course, for Hitler and his armies. It will be devastating for the Soviet armies too. Millions and millions would die. But Stalin, it's a very interesting situation. You have this communist country that's cooperating with Western democracies during World War II. So Stalin and Hitler had made an agreement, and the agreement was that during the war, that they would not invade each other. And here they are, and they're walking down the Eastern Front, and clearly they do not trust each other as they're hiding guns behind their backs. In 1941, the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, and there was a reason why Stalin didn't trust Hitler, and Hitler would ultimately invade his country. Devastating in terms of the numbers of lives lost. Leningrad, Stalingrad would have major loss of life. But long story short, eventually the Red Army will be able to push the Germans back into their land. And of course, D-Day in 1944, the United States and Britain and French troops were able to push the Germans back the other direction, and eventually Germans will be defeated. So after World War II, the Soviet Union emerges as a world power. So you have the United States and the Soviet Union that are clearly the two of the most powerful countries in the world. And so they're going to have a little event that hopefully you've heard of called the Cold War. And they are fighting over who can develop the most bombs. We're going to see the Soviet Union becomes friends with North Korea. The Soviet Union becomes friends with China. The Soviet Union becomes friends with Vietnam, and the Soviet Union becomes friends with Cuba. They're making friends. They have more friends than I do, and they're making friends with the communist countries all around the world. And if you remember, you're going to remember the Bay of Pigs, and that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union is going to bring their missiles into Cuba and point them at the United States. Right? What about these countries here? You know, we focus on Germany, we focus on the Soviet Union. What about these countries here? And, you know, between the war, World War I and World War II, most went to from democratic to authoritarian governments. Most will be mainly agricultural societies. They're not really developing high levels of industry. But also really important is both of them are going to be vulnerable to the Nazis and the Soviets. The Nazis are over here, Soviets are over here. It's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So eventually the Nazis would invade these Eastern European countries. We saw the movie The Pianist taking place in Poland, and the Germans will occupy many of these lands. Remember Czechoslovakia, we talked about in class as well. And for 4 years, Eastern Europe would fall under the leadership of the Nazi regime and subject to the Holocaust. The Jews there would unfortunately die in high numbers. As you can see, these are the numbers of Jews killed in the respective countries. 1943, the Red Armies are going to liberate these Eastern European countries. All these countries here are going to be liberated by the Soviet Union. And that's great. And then the Soviet Union says, okay, but now we're taking you over. So they were controlled by the Nazis for 4 years. Now they're going to be controlled by the Soviet Union all the way until the Soviet Union collapses, really in 1991. So all these Soviet-sponsored regimes, okay, all these countries here are basically controlled by the Soviet Union, and in these countries, we're going to see things like mass education and propaganda. Every single school must be teaching that the Soviet Union is good. We're going to see collectivization of agriculture. Stalin did it. These guys will do it too. We're going to see industrialization of 5-year plans being implemented also in these countries. Most of these countries are going to join the Warsaw Pact. Remember, we talked about NATO and the Warsaw Pact in class. And for sure, the Soviets are going to be sending their soldiers to monitor these countries here and making sure that they remain good little Soviets. Of course, infamously, we know about the Berlin Wall, and that would be built in 1961 to keep people on the Soviet land that were trying to escape. So the Communist Party also was trying to change the culture, okay? They didn't want people to be Orthodox Christians. Orthodox Christianity had been around for so many years when the Byzantines visited Kiev and Rus. And so it was a big part of Russian culture. That is going to be challenged by the Soviets, and the status of the church is going to decline. Any artwork, any piece of writing must be pro-communist. Any education must be pro-communist. And another thing is that art and literature, anything from Western Europe dealing with art and literature, was viewed as being very negative under the communist regime. If you wanted to really be somebody in the Soviet Union, you should be a scientist or engineer. The Soviets, the communists, knew that they needed these individuals to help them with their country, and they were compensated very well. A lot of power, a lot of prestige, at least, heavily funded and necessary. So this is a missile that was actually going to be shipped out to Cuba. And none of this would be possible without the people that we just talked about. 1920s to 1950s. This picture, full disclosure, was taken in the 1980s, but it was the best that I could do here. But once again, government is controlling all sectors of the economy, the communist system. That's what it does. Over time, there were complaints in the Soviet Union of the products that the government factories were making were not good products. Lines were very, very long. Shelves would be running out of supplies. This might be looking familiar to us right now with the current situation that we're going through. I haven't seen toilet paper in over a week, but it's a very difficult situation. I'm sure your families are going through complications with this as well. And you understand how frustrating this can be. But imagine if you're one of these people in this picture, and it's frustrating. You have supplies, food that you need for your family. The Soviet Union, industrialization will change the people. More people are moving into the cities. The cities become very crowded. Housing becomes very crowded. They're now going to prefer a nuclear family, and birth rate is going to drop. Stalin will die, and the next guy you need to know, 1956, will take over the Soviet Union. His name is Khrushchev. Here he is sitting with JFK. But Khrushchev was not as hardcore as Stalin was. He was a dictator, but he's going to really be a less extreme dictator. He's actually going to criticize Stalin for doing a lot of the things that he will do. I like this right here. Outright critics of the government are less likely to be executed. Instead of being executed, they're going to send you to a mental institution because you must be crazy if you don't like communism. But even though Khrushchev backs down on the hardcore stuff with communism, bottom line is the communists are still fully in control. From Khrushchev to Gorbachev, who will be the last leader, the Soviets are cautious with their diplomacy. They're rarely engaging in war, and they are always trying to be prepared because they never know when they might end up in a war. So, the Cold War was a race to space, for example, battling different ideas, and the Soviets are going to win the race to space. In 1957, they're going to launch Sputnik, which is the first satellite ever to orbit space. Now, there's so many satellites, but this was the first one, and the very first person, Yuri Gagarin, first person to fly into space. 1960s, things are changing. The Soviets open up a little bit more to the West, allow a little bit more media to come in. But bottom line is this, by the 1980s, there's way too many problems in the Soviet Union. They don't have the consumer goods available for the people, and the consumer goods they have are usually not great. There's very little reason to work in a communist system work hard, at least, because everybody's pretty much making the same amount of money, which is a major element of communism. So there's really no motive for a lot of people to go that extra mile. And a lot of Russians, this is not a stereotype, it's history. A lot of Russians will turn to alcoholism. 1985 onward, the Soviet Union begins to fall apart. Yes, they're going to try to do some reforms. They're going to try to save their country, and it's going to be not enough. You have to understand that the Soviets are spending a lot of their money on military instead of building hospitals and bridges and roads and all of that stuff, schools that a country needs. They spend a lot of that money on the military instead, and the United States as well will be spending a lot of money on the military, and they continue to do so. 1980s, the economy of Soviet Union is stagnant. There's health problems. Rivers are going to be polluted. They have the highest infant mortality rates in the world. Military spending is 1/3 of the national income, and worker morale is very, very low. People are not motivated to get up and get to work. Last guy here that you really need to know is Gorbachev. I always recognize him because he has that little birthmark on his head. And as you can see here, he does a lot of things. He's going to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons that the Soviets are going to have. But there's two policies that I really want you to understand and to know is glasnost and perestroika. What glasnost does is says, hey, if you are against our government, you can go out onto the street and say communism sucks. It doesn't matter. Okay, you can openly criticize our government. And perestroika was a lot like the new economic policy that Lenin did, which allowed private ownership of land, also encouraged private ownership of land and private ownership of factories and farms and that kind of stuff, encouraged foreign investment, allowed the British, the French, the Americans to come in and invest into the country. And also Gorbachev will have reductions in Soviet spending so they can spend Soviet military spending so they can spend money in other areas. Even though these changes come in, it's not going to save the country. These Eastern European countries, by the late 1980s, they are going to free themselves from Soviet rule. East Germany is the most notable. The Berlin Wall is going to come down. East and West Germany will be reunited again, but all these countries in Eastern Europe will gain their independence from the Soviets. And finally, 1991, the Soviet Union is going to be collapsing. The Soviet Union was a communist country. Communism is now going to be taken away. They're going to move more to democracies and parliamentary systems. But as you could imagine, it's not easy to change from communism to democracy overnight. Russia struggled with that transition to capitalism and voting and all that stuff. And they continue to struggle today. I really appreciate your time. Once again, please get the notes down on this as soon as possible and send it to me. Also, please make sure that you're keeping up with the outlines as well. Also be checking that online distance learning tab that I set up on the faculty webpage. There you can find updates, information that I need to communicate to you guys, whether it's assignments, whether it's about the AP test, whatever the case may be. All right.